Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Wednesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is an absolutely gorgeous Wednesday, October 8th, 2014, here in Appalachia. I'm sure you know that those of you from the east, southeast region, we went through some pretty raucous weather last evening. We had tornado warnings all around us, and that's not very common in Appalachia. It doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, it's serious. And this was serious, and it was the news, the local news and weather people at midnight last night were following the progress of this twister, or suspected twister, if you will, as it crossed one of the highways about 20 miles south of where I'm standing right now. So it was quite an experience, and of course the wind blew and the lightning flashed and the thunder banged, and it was quite an exciting night. But as often happens when you follow a storm like that, we woke up to absolutely the most gorgeous blue sky and beautiful day that one could possibly hope for. It is absolutely beautiful. I missed yesterday's program, as some of you will know, and I was unable to provide warning for that on Monday. But I had a meeting that kind of took shape. It was kind of floating in that we weren't sure when it was going to happen because it involved a couple of people with different schedules. And when everything started to take shape, it just so happened that it was yesterday, right in the middle of the day. And so consequently, we kind of had to suspend our live program yesterday. Of course, it is our abbreviated one anyway. It's an hour and a half rather than 2 hours. But we are back together again today, and I am so looking forward to it. I absolutely thoroughly enjoy these kinds of programs. I went out and shared a sandwich with my wife about an hour ago before we came on the air, and I was telling her that, you know, we were sitting there eating, just having a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and I was telling her that I mean, a day like this, to think that, you know, as beautiful a day as this is, and here we are together enjoying a sandwich with the sun coming in the window, knowing that when I get done, I'm going to get back to the house and I'm going to be visiting with you folks at the Virtual Center for a couple of hours. It just doesn't get any better than that. And I just want you to know how appreciative I am of the opportunity to be here, and how appreciative I am of your willingness to be here as well. We would love to hear from you and on our program today and on the issues we're talking about, and I'll kind of touch on those in a moment. But let me give you the phone number and my email address so that you will be prepared. You can have a pen and paper handy and jot these down. And then if something occurs to you during the course of the program that you would like to sound off on, or ask questions about, or raise issues about, by all means, we would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you would like to communicate directly with me on these issues related to the Virtual Center, I would love to hear from you that way as well. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien, O-B-R-I-E-N, 906, no punctuation at all one word, at gmail.com. Did receive, after Monday's program, did receive a very nice email from Michael, one of our listeners, and he was referring to the conversation, to the dialogue we focused on Monday between Bruce Wayne and his butler, Alfred. And if you remember the the scenario, the situation in which that dialogue took place. And of course, as we know, it ended with Alfred telling Bruce Wayne that the way they ended up taking care of the bandit was to burn down the forest. And Michael was making a point that as he was listening to that, he couldn't help but translate it or apply it into the context of what's happening in the world today in terms of the environment and what we're doing to ourselves and to our planet in the interest of short-term profit. We have no idea what we're doing long-term to the planet or to the air we breathe, to the culture and the economy we live in. But in the interest of short-term profit, we're more than willing to take that chance. And I think all I could say to Michael was great comment. I wish it had been on the air, because I think that it's a very, very telling comment. And the only comment that I made in reference to that, to Michael, was that that's why certain pieces, certain resources like this particular dialogue from Batman, The Dark Knight, what makes a particular piece of evidence like this, a primary source like this, so valuable is that it's so substantive that it can be applied in a number of different venues, a number of different situations and contexts. And I think that's what really defines the quality of a primary source. And that's where the value and the skills of the, in this case, teacher, come from. You know, the classroom teacher or the instructor who can make a determination that this particular document says enough that is substantive to warrant the kind of reflection and the kind of speculation in those who are exposed to it, that they can learn so much from it because it is so applicable to so many different situations. I guess that's the criterion that I use in trying to select documents and trying to pick and choose amongst the Federalist Papers and those things that we've been looking at. So what I would like to do, what I would propose that we do today, is to complete Federalist number 40, which we've made 2 stabs at, both last Wednesday, a week ago today, and then this past Monday as well. We got through the initial phases of Federalist number 40, written by James Madison, but we really didn't complete it. And I thought that I'd like to complete it today. That was what I had intended to do yesterday, because we had the abbreviated program yesterday, and I thought, well, in 90 minutes we can do this. And so I'm convinced that we can complete Federalist number 40 today. As well. And then I'd like to go into another issue, which is a contemporary one, which is an issue that is alive and well today. It's based on an op-ed piece that was in the New York Times yesterday, and it applies to a number of our states and their fiscal or their financial situations today. But it sparked a trip back into the 18th century for me, because it raised issues that made me think of the very famous line that is often quoted by Thomas Jefferson about the fact that the earth belongs to the living. And if you remember, a lot of people will cite that and say that as a result of that particular line from Jefferson, that it really is not virtuous, it really is not moral for one generation to bind another and saddle them with debt. But as you know, that's exactly what's happening in today's world in so many different ways. So what I would like to do is I would like to, once we finish Federalist number 40, I'd like to touch on the piece that was in yesterday's New York Times, and then I'd like to look in a little bit more detail, and this will probably take us into the first program next week, which is next Monday, the 13th of October. And specifically, I'd like to get into Jefferson a little bit, because this particular line that is so often used about the earth, the earth belongs to the living, that's really the extent of it. Most people never really go beyond that. It's kind of like everybody knows what that means, so therefore nobody needs to spend time on where Jefferson comes up with this idea and what he meant by it and what he thinks, where it came from and why he thinks it's important. But lo and behold, you go back to the origins of this letter, which was a letter written by Thomas Jefferson from France to James Madison in 1789, which is right at the outset of the new government, right after the Constitution has officially been ratified, and the nation is engaged in what is usually referred to as the first federal elections, when the first Congress is being elected under the Constitution of the United States. And of course the decision is made to elect by unanimous vote George Washington as President of the United States. In 1789, Jefferson writes Madison on this particular issue of one generation binding another, or should not be able to bind another. It's a fairly lengthy and substantive letter. And what I've learned, which I keep surprising myself, because I've seen this and learned this already so many different times, that it's hard to believe how deep and how substantive our founders were, not only in what they said, but the explanations and the rationale and the kind of analysis and appreciation of history that prompts them to make statements like the one about the earth belonging to the living. So I'd like to go there, but I'd like first to finish Federalist number 40. The letter that I was referring to from from Jefferson to James Madison, was written from Paris on the 6th of September, 1789. So it's the early fall of 89, and of course Washington has already been sworn in, is already President of the United States, but Washington has yet to appoint his cabinet. And when he makes those appointments, of course, he selects Jefferson as his Secretary of State. And Jefferson leaves France and comes back to the United States to assume that post in the Washington administration. And of course, Washington also appoints Alexander Hamilton as his first Treasury Secretary. And we know that that sets off a whole new set, a whole different set of circumstances and political actions and activities that we know ultimately results in the development of America's two-party system. It's a fabulous letter. But first, I'd like to take our time to make sure today that we successfully complete Federalist number 40. Let me again, before we begin, make sure that you have the phone number, because I would love to hear your thinking on some of these things. And specifically, what I would most like to hear from you is the fact that what we're learning about Madison and what we're learning about the sophisticated level of analysis on which Madison is basing the Federalist Papers is significant. Again, I don't want us to become befuddled by the trees, but rather I'd like to make sure that we keep our eye on the ball, so to speak, which is on the the forest itself. The internal ingredients of Madison's analysis are significant indeed, because I think they give us an awful lot of insight about what Madison believes he must do and the strategies he employs to do it. But at the same time, I think all the while we must keep in mind the background or the context of this particular issue. These are the Federalist Papers. These are, according to what historians tell us, and according to what the pundits tell us, these Federalist Papers are the most detailed explanation of how our constitutional system works. The implication of that is that our citizens ought to be able to understand and appreciate the political system within which they are blessed to live, which is a republic, and which was the world's first successful republican government that still continues in existence. It's the longest lasting popular government in the history of the world already. But the issue is, to be very, very honest about it, the issue is that what we're learning as we go through, especially 39 and now 40, is that Madison's analysis is so polished and so sophisticated. And let's remember, Madison is an attorney. Madison is a Princeton graduate. Madison was able to complete his bachelor's degree at Princeton in 3 years. Yet he stayed an additional year and plus, a couple of months beyond that, to continue to study under the tutelage of President Witherspoon of Princeton, and to immerse himself in the philosophies of the Enlightenment and the history of the world and the history of its republics. Madison's level of education and sophistication is admirable and is to be envied. But to assume that Madison is making a case which the voters of New York could understand, or that citizens of America, of the United States today can understand, it seems to me is well beyond the realm of possibility. I think that's what we have to appreciate. The purpose of the Federalist Papers was to convince the people of New York that they needed to, and it was safe for them to, ratify the Constitution of the United States. And in order to do that, he had to take on the principal criticisms being leveled at that Constitution. And he did it in a way and at a sophisticated rhetorical level, which obviously was way beyond the ability of the average person to understand. So the fact of the matter is, the Federalist Papers, as Madison wrote them, and as Hamilton wrote them also, were not designed to enlighten and educate the people on why they should. Rather, they were designed to convince the people that it was safe and okay to do it. Because the possibility of rejecting the Constitution of the United States was absolutely the worst outcome possible. And anything short of that would be successful. So in a sense, Madison is writing on different levels of sophistication. depending on one's ability and education level, different people are able to understand different degrees of Madison's argument and the sophistication of his analysis. And what I have tried to do here at the Virtual Center, and again, who am I? I'm making an effort, and again, I appreciate the fact that it's an effort that a lot of people couldn't make. And I think I feel very, very honored to believe that because of the background I'm fortunate to have and the experience, the years of experience that I've had in these particular subjects and topics, I feel comfortable in offering my view as to how Madison is making his arguments. But at the same time, I recognize that they are extremely sophisticated and extremely complicated. They're difficult to understand, and I find myself rereading the same paragraph sometimes 3 and 4 times in order to make sure that what I think I'm seeing is indeed what I am seeing. I think what I'm saying is that it's the process itself is confirming in my mind more than I was even convinced before that the story of ratification here is important for what it is and for what it is not. It is not an effort to educate the citizenry of the United States in the methods, the strategies, and operational innards, if you will, of the constitutional system. It is a system, once you appreciate how Madison is explaining the way it works, it's a system that very few people could hope to understand. Yet it's a system that many students are required to take courses in. And many students fail because they find it impossible to understand and explain how this system really works. More important than that, they really don't find it worth struggling with to find out. And I think that says a lot, not about our students, as much as it does the architect of this system and what they were trying to accomplish. It just so happens, and let me give you a little bit of background to where I'm coming from right here, and then we'll get into Madison's Federalist number 40 in a little bit more detail. In the class that I am teaching this semester, this morning I received papers that my students were given as a take-home assignment, and they were asked to write up an analysis of Thomas Jefferson's proposals for the general diffusion of knowledge in Virginia, as he explained the process in his notes on the state of Virginia, which were published in 1784, I believe. At least the date on the document that I have is 1784. And in order that I would not sway or influence in any way the interpretation of that document that students reached, I handed the assignment out a week ago. I told them it would be due today and that we would take class time as necessary. If there was anything they wanted to raise about it, if there were any questions they wanted to ask about it, if they wanted to break into smaller groups and interact with their fellow students on particular aspects of the document in order to better understand not only what it says, but more importantly, how different people were interpreting what it says. But I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be the influence. This morning I took up the papers. And after they were handed in, one of the students made a comment and he said, "Can I say something about that document?" And I said, "Of course you can." And he turned around and looked at the rest of the class, and it's not a big class. There's only about eight or nine in there. 7, actually, I think, were there today. And he said to his fellow classmates, Am I crazy, or did any of the others of you get this out of that document? And then he said, I was absolutely blown away when I read Jefferson saying about the boy of best genius being raked from the rubbish annually and educated at public expense. He said, rake from the rubbish. Did anybody else react to that particular language? And I said, well, what did he mean by it? And he proceeded to explain the way Jefferson used it and meant it. And he said it's kind of like the merit system, that what you do is you test everybody, and the assumption is that the brightest kids will get the highest scores. And I guess that's what Jefferson was doing, and he explained it something like that. And of course, that indeed is exactly what's happening. And then I said, we're talking about the boy of best genius, and we can focus on the education for the boy of best genius, because he was talking about the fact that Jefferson said they go on to William and Mary, the ones that are selected and all the rest of it. And I said, no, I'm interested in the rubbish. What does he mean by the rubbish? When he's talking about everybody who's not the boy of best genius, what's he talking about? And the student said, he's talking about all of us. The people. And so then the question is, what about the education that they receive? Well, he said they received 3 years at public expense. And I said, well, you went to school. How much did you learn in 3 years, the first 3 years of your public education? How much can you realistically expect to learn as a child in the first 3 years of public education? And of course, the group kind of focused on that and reflected on that for a couple of seconds. And so then the question is, well, what does that tell you about the level at which they are going to read and function as educated, virtuous citizens? What will they be able to do? What will they not be able to do? And that's my point, of course, is this particular document, Federalist number 39 and Federalist number 40 by James Madison. Because there's no way on God's earth that students educated for 3 years only, the first 3 years of public school, could hope to understand and appreciate the depth of what Madison is doing here. One must conclude, therefore, that either citizens in the 18th century were much smarter than they are now, or one must conclude that Jefferson had no intention that the mass of the population would ever be able to understand what he and Madison are talking about in their exchange of letters. If you could conclude that the latter seems most likely to be true, if you conclude that that's really what Jefferson was about, then it seems to be the next question we must ask ourselves is, when it comes to educating the population, then, what is Jefferson talking about? And of course, he's talking about a high level of sophistication in education for the brightest kids and a totally different approach to education for everybody else. He's talking about educating leaders at William and Mary and educating followers everywhere else. And if you take that conclusion and you take it from 1784, when the notes in the state of Virginia were written, and add 5 years to it in 1789, when the new government goes into effect, then you have to conclude that what Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay were writing and arguing in the Federalist Papers by intent, by design, was way over and way above the heads of the average population. In a sense, then, the citizens of America, of the 13 states, were being asked to go out and support a constitutional system for the United States, which very few of them did not and could not possibly understand. I think that that lesson, that reality, is one that all of us must take seriously and must begin to appreciate. Because while I wish the result, I could say something different, the fact of the matter is I'm not sure that all that much has changed in the 220 years or whatever since 1788 when these particular Federalist Papers were written. I wish I could say that the alternative was true, and that our education system had advanced to the point that the average person could understand these kinds of things because they receive an education which would prepare them to adequately understand it. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have it, and given the rising opposition to reforms like the Common Core, we still have very significant elements in our society who don't want the people to have it and don't want the people to understand. I think we have to take that information and deal with it for what it's worth. I think we have to recognize that that's where we're coming from, and that's what we're dealing with, and that's our challenge. I think the best example that I can give for this are the results that we are seeing in this current election season with the fall congressional elections coming up in 1 day less than a month, 4 weeks from yesterday. The amount of money from organized interest groups, so-called PACs, that is pouring into the states in order to buy influence to the elections, which will be happening in 4 weeks in those states, and the fact that those with money are willing to invest tens of thousands, if not millions of dollars in particular campaigns in order to influence voters, is because they recognize the very same thing that we just concluded here in an analysis of Jefferson's program for education in the state of Virginia. Namely, that the way citizens vote is not driven by what they understand, by what they believe, who they listen to, who they trust, and what they believe to be telling them the truth. Therefore, the entire political system functions around access to information, access to the voters, the ability to fashion sophisticated political arguments aimed in support of or against particular candidates. The idea being to influence voters on how they should vote, not to educate them. In fact, I would argue that the process itself indicates that those who are putting up the money know that the citizenry is not educated enough to understand the intricacies of the campaign. Therefore, they will behave, they will vote according to what they believe. So consequently, what our political system aims to do is influence those who do not already have well-developed, sophisticated political philosophies and positions on issues. Those people, the money is intended to try to isolate and to define as radicals, people that the voters should not listen to. And where the money is aimed instead is enlisting the active support of those people who believe the political positions being articulated in these ads, aimed specifically at those voters who have not made up their minds one way or another, and therefore are susceptible to being influenced by the argument or the campaign ad that they see the most. All that's necessary then is to make sure that you get these campaign ads in front of the people as many times as you can up to the elections. Conclusion: what we are currently witnessing in the way our political campaign system is functioning seems to me to support, beyond a shadow of a doubt, the interpretation of what the founders are saying and what Madison is proving in the way the Constitution of the United States is being explained to the American people, is being presented to the American people. I don't think it's un-American or radical or communist or anything else to say that, because I think the evidence supports it. I do believe that all of us have to take it for what it's worth and proceed accordingly. With that, and we have just passed the bottom of our first hour together. It's 37 minutes after the hour in our hour one of our time together today. I want to go back again to Federalist number 40 and very quickly lay the groundwork for where we're going and what we are doing. If you'll remember, Madison set out in 39 and 40 to respond to two anti-federalist criticisms of the Constitution. The first one was that it violated the tenets of republicanism. And that's the issue that Madison takes on in Federalist number 39. The second issue of criticism being leveled by the anti-federalists against the Constitution is that the convention that drafted the Constitution had overstepped its bounds. It had gone way beyond the charge or the commission or the instructions which were given to the delegates sent to Philadelphia to meet in convention in May of 1787. And that's the issue that Madison takes on in Federalist number 40. And on Monday, I think I began this argument by laying out the ingredients for what I believe is a very a possible argument about the illegality of the Constitution of the United States, because it goes well beyond the charge from Congress, the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. The Constitutional Convention makes the decision at the outset to scrap the Articles of Confederation and to begin again with a totally new system of government in the form of the Virginia Plan, which was written by James Madison, circulated at the convention by Governor Edmund Randolph of Virginia. And of course, it's very, very important to note, just as an aside, that Edmund Randolph becomes an opponent of the Constitution that is drafted in Philadelphia, even though he is the host of the convention once it convenes in May. Randolph's particular consideration or concern about the Constitution is its lack of a Bill of Rights. So I think that's an important point to keep in mind as well. What Madison does, and this is review, what Madison does, of course, is begin by saying there are two sources, or there are two basic documents which are referred to most of the time by critics who are arguing that the convention had overstepped its legitimate bounds, that in creating the Constitution and scrapping the Articles of Confederation and making the decision that 9 states rather than the required 13 states be enough to declare the Constitution ratified violates not only the spirit but the letter of the instructions that were given to the delegates in Philadelphia. And Madison said, since these two documents, namely the call for a convention issued at in Annapolis the previous September, that's the document written by Alexander Hamilton, you'll recall, or the second document is the call for the convening of the Constitutional Convention issued by Congress in February of 1787, 3 months before the scheduled convention was to happen. And Madison says, since these two documents are the basis on which most of the anti-federalist challenges to the legitimacy of the Constitutional Convention are based, therefore, Madison says, we've got to start with those two documents. And then he proceeds to quote them both. And the point that I made on Monday, and I'll repeat it here without all the supporting evidence in the interest of time, Madison points, the reality is, the history of the situation is that it is the call from Annapolis in September of 86, delivered to Congress, that precipitates or prompts Congress to issue the call for the convention. In other words, the two documents do not happen independently of each other. The Annapolis Convention call for a convention leads to the congressional call for the convention, which leads to the convening of the convention itself. Madison is unwilling to accept that sequence of events. He finds it necessary and he finds it legitimate to base the legitimacy of the convention on Congress's call for a constitutional convention for the sole purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. But then, in order to justify the fact that the convention went further than the revision of the Articles of Confederation, he finds it necessary to go back to the Annapolis call in order to find justification for the rest. In a sense, Madison is engaging in some fast, shifty rhetorical footwork here. Because one would assume that if the convention followed through on Annapolis's call for a convention, if Congress followed through by issuing such a call, then that should be the last that anybody would ever have to look at the Annapolis Convention document. And that everything from that point on would be grounded in the congressional call for a convention. But the reality is that Congress's call for a convention didn't go far enough to justify the scrapping of the articles and the creation of an entirely new constitutional system. In order to legitimize that, Madison has to go back beyond Congress to the document which caused Congress to act in the first place. And Madison does it. And so consequently, it's the combination of the two documents together that provides the kind of documentary evidence that Madison believes he needs in order to argue for the legitimacy of the convention. And we went through both of the quotes and we looked at the difference. There's one additional point. Well, let me hold off there. Let me hold that conclusion. And of course, I'm assuming that I won't forget it by the time we get there, and I probably will if I run true to form. But anyway, what we know is that based on these two documents together, Madison draws conclusions for the reader. What he is doing is asking the reader to base everything that follows on the particular conclusions that he reaches, not on the substance of the document themselves. And I think this is significant. In other words, Madison quotes the documents, and then he gives the readers, provides for us, his conclusions as to what's in those documents. And everything that follows is based not on the documents, but on those conclusions that he reaches. And so basically what he's doing, very subtly, is suggesting that we no longer have to go back to the documents. All we need to do is rely on what he tells us they say. That gives him the power, the opportunity to perhaps read a little bit more into what is really in those documents and not have what he has done challenged. Because he's effectively making it unnecessary for us to go back to the source. What he's saying is, I went to the source, I quoted them to you, now here's basically what we need to get out of them. Bang, 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 bang. 1, 2, 3, 4. And then he goes on and he expects us to go on with him. What he does not expect us to do is take each of the 4 points that conclusions that he reaches and go back to the quotes and test whether in fact they're really there or not. And that's what we did on Monday. And if you do that, it seems to me you can conclude nothing else but that Madison is reading things into those quotes that may not be there. Specifically, he says as his very first conclusion that the object of the convention was to establish in these states a firm national government. Neither one of the documents necessarily say that. They say that the revisions in the articles would create a more efficient national government conducive to the exigencies of the Union. But neither one of them allows for the fact that you can go on and add to things over and above that. In other words, make changes beyond the revisions to the articles, changes which include totally scrapping them. He's got to try to justify that. And so his first one is that the object of the convention was to create a firm national government. Second, that this government was to be such as would be adequate to the exigencies of government and the preservation of the Union. And that's true. Those words are exactly almost quoted verbatim from the documents. The difference is the documents don't say that it's the new national government that will do this. It's the revisions of the Articles of Confederation that will accomplish this. And third, Madison said these purposes were to be effected by alterations in provisions of the Articles of Confederation as expressed in the Act of Congress, and here's the addition, or by such further provisions as should appear necessary as it stands in the Recommendatory Act from Annapolis. That's the key part of these four conclusions. The fact that he adds that what they will create what they create at the convention will be based on the alterations and provisions in the articles as it originally stands, or further provisions which will appear necessary to the convention. And where that comes from is the Recommendatory Act from Annapolis. He's got to go back there to September in order to justify the fact that the convention made further provisions beyond revisions of the Articles of Confederation. And fourth, and this is of course quite accurate, that what comes out of the convention, the alterations and provisions, were to be reported to Congress and to the states in order to be agreed to by the former, by Congress, and confirmed by the latter, by the states. So he has reached those four conclusions. Now he proceeds to reduce those conclusions even more succinctly. He's bringing us paragraph by paragraph to where he wants us to be. And so now comes the next iteration, if you will, of these four conclusions. From a comparison and fair construction of these several modes of expression, Madison says, is to be deduced the authority under which the convention acted. They were to frame a national government adequate to the exigencies of government and of the Union, and to reduce the Articles of Confederation into such form as to accomplish these purposes. What Madison has done is find the justification for the convention to create a new national government from two documents, in neither of which the right to create a national government is included. And that's what he's been able to accomplish. Again, going back to the comments made initially, there's no way that the average reader is going to be able to handle the sophisticated nuances that Madison is employing on this rhetorical journey that he's taking us in order to find within two quotations justification for actions that aren't there. He has to do it, but he has to do it at a level and in a way which people will never realize what he's done. And he's doing it for what appears in the newspapers. These are articles that are out there for everybody to see. But there's nowhere in the world that the average reader is going to be able to see this. And then, and this is where we stopped on Monday, I think this next paragraph is a wow paragraph. Because I think what we see here is Madison at his best, depending on how you interpret it, or his worst. He begins by telling us there are two rules of construction dictated by plain reason, as well as founded on legal axioms. One is that every part of the expression, if possible, ought to be allowed some meaning and be made to conspire to some common end. What he's saying is, whenever you are dealing with a passage or a paragraph or a document or a source, and you are reducing it to its ultimate meaning, you must make sure that all that's in that paragraph is incorporated and included in your conclusion. What you can't do is take one particular idea or one particular aspect of a long statement and base your conclusion on it to the exclusion of the rest of the document. In other words, if the conclusion is to be valid, it needs to be one which encompasses and is supported by everything that's in the document. That's one of the rules of construction dictated by plain reason in one's argument. What Madison is talking about here is, in order to make acceptable, legitimate arguments, there are two rules of construction necessary. One is that everything that's included in a particular paragraph, statement, or document needs to be included and consistent with the conclusions drawn. The other, this is the second rule of construction, Madison says, is that where the several parts cannot be made to coincide. In other words, when you can't come up with a conclusion that incorporates all parts of the particular source, the less important must give way to the more important part. The means should be sacrificed to the end, rather than the end to the means. We didn't say this on Monday. This is new. But let me ask you, what is Madison saying by including this paragraph? When Madison says in any argument there are two basic rules of construction. One is that your conclusions have to be supported by everything that's in the document, in the source, not just a portion of what's in the document. And the second thing is, when you can't do that, then you got to make a choice between which is the most important and which is the least important part of the two elements that you can't combine. You've got to be able to separate the means from the end and recognize that whenever it's necessary to reduce one to a secondary position, you got to reduce the means in favor of the ends, never the ends in favor of the means. What is Madison telling us? This is my interpretation. What Madison is telling us here is that he admits that what he has just done about the legitimacy of the Constitutional Convention is not consistent with the legitimate rules of argument and debate and logic, reason. He is admitting that he's violating the laws of argument. He is admitting that he's drawing conclusions that the evidence doesn't support. Take that one step further. What does that mean? James Madison, the author of the Constitution and the author of many of the most important of the Federalist Papers in defense of the Constitution, is admitting here to us that the evidence doesn't support what the convention did in Philadelphia. James Madison is admitting that on the face of it, the Constitution of the United States is not legal. We went too far, Madison is saying. And I admit that. But on the other hand, when you can't combine the elements of the evidence of the source, when you can't make them consistent, when you're stuck with two different conclusions or two different pieces of evidence which take you in different directions, you got to be able to separate them on the basis of which is the end and which is the means, which is the most important and which is the least important. Now he's going to go into the evidence for this. He's going to go into and explain exactly what he means here. This is the wow paragraph. Because in this paragraph, Madison is going to admit that the convention that drafted the Constitution of the United States went further than it was legitimately empowered to do, but that in order to accomplish the ends of the nation, it was impossible to sacrifice the means. Given the challenge that we faced, Madison is saying, it was necessary that we step over or around the rules under which we were empowered to operate. We had to break the rules, but the purpose for doing it is more important than the rules themselves. James Madison, the author of the Constitution of the United States, is admitting that, technically speaking, it is illegal because the convention was not authorized to go as far as it went. And he's asking people to accept the fact that the dangers to the nation and addressing the dangers to the nation was much more important than following the rules of commission that the delegates brought with them to Philadelphia. My God, that's significant. That is absolutely tremendously important. And the evidence for that is in the words of Thomas Jefferson himself in Federalist number 40. I think that this is one of the most important Federalist documents of all 85. But it's kind of interesting. I said that about number 85. I said that about number 39. I said that about number 10 and about number 51. There are a number of them. The interesting thing is that I believe that the most important ones are the ones written by James Madison. Because he's the author of the Constitution. He's the one that drafted the Virginia Plan. And he's the only one that's qualified to handle these kinds of sophisticated arguments at the level in which they must be handled. Hamilton couldn't take this on. Hamilton's arguments are much more direct. It doesn't mean that they're not good, and it doesn't mean that they're not polished and they're not sophisticated. Hamilton was a successful attorney. He was used to arguing in court. He was used to winning. But the kind of arguments that Madison is into here challenge even Alexander Hamilton. So Hamilton, understandably, is more than willing to hand the ball off on these particular issues to the one guy who can really handle them, which is James Madison. Who is James Madison? It's 4 minutes after 2 in the East, 4 minutes after the hour. Let's pause and take our break, take a 5-minute break on this, our Wednesday program for the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll be right back we invite you to please stay with us. We'll be right back, and we'll pursue more from James Madison and Federalist number 40. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. Here's Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is Bill O'Brien. I understand that we had a little bit of problem with the music we usually play during our break between hours, and we apologize for that. But if you have been with us through the entire program, we thank you for staying with us. If you're just joining us, we're well into Federalist number 40, and we're on a roll today. We're going to finish it, I promise. We invite you to share your ideas and your thoughts with us. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, waobrien906 @gmail.com. That's waobrien, OBRIEN, 906 @gmail.com. If you are just joining us, we finished the top of our last hour by looking at a particular paragraph about a third of the way into Federalist number 40, and the analysis of the content of that document of Federalist number 40 seems to me, I was basically explaining my analysis, to constitute an admission by James Madison himself, an admission that the convention, the Constitutional Convention of 1787, in scrapping the Articles of Confederation and replacing it with the Constitution of the United States, did indeed exceed its legitimate commission from the states. Madison's use of rhetorical points of argument to make the case that yes, in order to draw conclusions from a piece of evidence, one must incorporate all that's in the source in order to draw conclusions about it. And the implication, he doesn't say this, but the part that he doesn't say for that rationale is that to select one particular portion of a quote and take it out of context because it seems to support what the conclusion that you want to reach is not legitimate. So Madison acknowledges that in order to draw a conclusion about a particular piece of evidence, all that's in that evidence must be incorporated and included in the conclusion. But then Madison acknowledges that that's not always possible, and that sometimes there are competing and different ideas within the same piece of evidence, within the same document, as you were, or speech, or policy, or whatever it is that you're referring to. And when that happens, Madison said, you got to make some choices. Specifically, you got to determine the ends from the means, which is the most important, which is the least important. In other words, if you have two contradictory arguments competing for your vote, the one you vote for is the one that is more important, not the one that's less important. And then Madison is going to take that principle and relate it specifically to the Constitutional Convention and to what happened in this particular situation. He says, and I'm going to read this rather rapidly because I think that the overall significance of what this paragraph means is critical. Madison said, suppose then that the expressions defining the authority of the convention were irreconcilably at variance with each other. Madison is starting out by saying, let's suppose that the critics are right. Let's suppose that the issues defining the authority of the convention are at variance and not consistent with each other. That a national and adequate government could not possibly, in the judgment of the convention, be affected by alterations and provisions in the Articles of Confederation. In other words, for the purposes of argument, let's acknowledge that the critics, the anti-federalist critics of the Constitution, of the Convention, are right. Let's admit that the issues relating to the authority of the Convention are at variance with each other, and that the fact of the matter is a national and adequate government could not possibly happen within the context of the provisions of the Articles of Confederation. In other words, let's acknowledge that there's a conflict here. Let's acknowledge that the Articles of Confederation are not capable of being repaired enough to address the issues of the country, which is the need for an adequate national government sufficient to meet the exigencies of the nation. Which part, Madison says, of the definition ought to have been embraced, and which one rejected? Let the most scrupulous expositors of the delegated powers, let the most inveterate objectors against those exercised by the convention answer these questions. In other words, what Madison is doing literally is throwing the situation right in the face of those who would criticize what the convention did. He says, let's imagine you're right. For purposes of argument, let's say you're right. That the two documents are inconsistent with each other. Consequently, that if the convention stayed within the confines of the Articles of Confederation, they would not have been able to fashion the kind of government that would meet the needs of the nation. What should they have done, Madison says? What was their choice? Which one should they have embraced? Which one should they have rejected? Which was the most important? Which was the less important? Which the end? Which the means? What Madison is saying is the convention did indeed face a quandary. What they needed to do, they realized they couldn't do because the Articles of Confederation did not contain what they needed to do it. Consequently, in order to come up with something that would work, they had to go outside the legitimate bounds of their own commission, of the legitimate power which those who sent them to Philadelphia had given them. Madison is admitting that the convention overstepped its bounds. He's admitting it. He said, let's take the most outspoken, the most scrupulous objectors, the people that are screaming the loudest about what the convention done. Let's ask them to answer these questions. Let them declare, Madison says, whether it was most important to the happiness of the people of America that the Articles of Confederation should be disregarded and an adequate government be provided and the Union preserved, or that an adequate government should be omitted, the Articles of Confederation be preserved. Let them declare whether the preservation of these articles was the end for securing which a reform of the government was to be introduced as the means, or whether the establishment of a government adequate to the national happiness was the end. That is a wow paragraph. Because in that paragraph, What Madison is saying to the anti-federalists, to the critics who argue that the convention overstepped its bounds, Madison is saying, what would you have done if you were sent there to fix the Union and you found that the tools that you were given to do it, which was the Articles of Confederation, wouldn't work, and you needed to bring in additional tools? What would you have done? Would you have stuck to your commission and not addressed the needs of the nation? Or would you have scrapped the Articles in favor of a government that would meet the needs of the nation? Which is the means, which is the end, Madison said. The convention was confronted with a conflict, with a contradiction, with a challenge. And given which of the two sides was most important, they made a choice. And then he's saying to the critics, under those conditions, what choice would you have made? And of course, the implication there is you'd have done the same darn thing that they did. This entire argument is an admission that the anti-federalist critics of the Constitution are correct, and that the convention did indeed overstep its legitimate charge. In a court of law, an objective judge would have to believe that in an up or down vote, the Constitution of the United States, textually, according to the letter of the law, was illegitimate. Do you believe for 1 second that the Supreme Court of the United States, if confronted with the same question, would scrap the Constitution of the United States? I would suggest to you that they would find a way to not do that. And the way they would find would be to look at ends and means, the same thing that Madison does, and make the decision that it's much more important to solve the problem than it is to work within the confines of the tools you've been given to solve it when those tools are inadequate. I would suggest to you that if confronted with this argument, Antonin Scalia would become an advocate of the living Constitution. He would come up with the changes necessary to not have to live with the textual interpretation of the letter of the law, because that interpretation would not lead him to the conclusion that he believes he would need to reach. I think that this document, interpreted properly and completely, is a fabulous justification for the realities of the need for a living Constitution, for a Constitution that must adjust and must adapt. What Madison is saying here in number 40 is that the convention did what they had to do. They solved the problem. And if the tools that they were given to solve it were not adequate, they threw out those tools and brought in new ones. What would you have them do? Madison says. What should they have done? Tell me that argument is not incredibly significant historically and constitutionally to the lexicon, to the litany, if you will, of the treatment of the Federalist Papers. I think it's incredibly important. I think what Madison has done is absolutely critical. There's just one or two further comments I'd like to make about 40, because there's still, that's about halfway through the document. There's quite a bit more on the document about the sophistication of Madison's argument, and I'd like to make a reference to them before we leave the document altogether. But let me make one additional point. Early in the program today, earlier in our first hour, I started to make a point, and then I said, well, let's hold on that. Let's keep that for later. And then I made the comment that, I'm more prone to forget when I do that. I'm more prone to forget these things. But lo and behold, I remembered this one. So let me make it now. I think that a major flaw, I'm not saying it is a flaw major enough to refute Madison's case. I think Madison makes a great case. I think he's right. I think the ends do justify the means. And I think the threats to the Union do indeed take precedence over what's in the Articles of Confederation, because what's in the Articles of Confederation was never intended to be able to meet the needs of the nation at the time of the Constitutional Convention, 10 years after the Articles were drafted. Remember, the Articles were drafted in 1777. They were not ratified until 1781 because the state of Maryland would not go along with the Articles of Confederation until the states that owned significant western lands, i.e. Virginia, mostly Virginia and Pennsylvania, were willing to turn over control of those western lands to the new Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Because Maryland realized and believed that if you bought into the Articles of Confederation in 1777, you were acknowledging the fact that as the nation developed and as the population of the nation increased, certain states like Virginia and Pennsylvania would dominate the nation because they controlled vast portions of the western lands. And Maryland believed, and of course naturally being a state that did not have unlimited western lands, Maryland would believe this. Madison believed that the income and the contributions of the western lands to the future of the nation ought to be shared by all the states, not just a couple of them. So therefore, Maryland insisted that Virginia and Pennsylvania and some of the other states, Massachusetts, that controlled extensive western lands, cede those lands in the Articles to the Congress, to the new government. And until they did that, Maryland would not approve of the Articles. And because the Articles required the unanimous consent of all 13 states, Maryland by itself was able to keep the Articles of Confederation from going into effect from the time they were written in 1777 all the way up until 1781. For 4 years, one state was able to hold the entire nation at bay on the approval of the Articles of Confederation. So, I think that's an important story. But let me go back to my key point here. Madison's entire argument here in Federalist number 40, that even though he finally admits, as reluctant to do so as he is, that the convention did indeed overstep its bounds by scrapping the articles and replacing them with a totally new constitution. Madison's whole case is based on the fact that the threat to the Union, coming up with a government that would meet the exigencies of the Union, was the ultimate objective. It was the most important thing to do. Sticking to the ingredients of the Articles of Confederation was not. And Madison is asking readers to accept that logic. Let me make one point that calls into question the legitimacy of that argument. It doesn't refute it. I don't think it's enough to prove that Madison's argument is invalid, but I think it weakens his argument a little bit, and so therefore I think we should consider it. The decision to scrap the Articles of Confederation and to replace it with a totally new government, the Virginia Plan, which becomes the Constitution, was not made during the course of the debates in the convention. It was made before the convention ever opened. The mere fact that the Virginia Plan was already written up and already drafted before the convention ever came into existence, before the convention even convened, suggests a flaw in Madison's argument, because Madison is making the case that once the convention was able to compare the realities of the threat to the Union with the tools given them to meet those needs by the Articles, and made the decision that it wasn't going to work, and therefore they would have to put the ends before the means, Madison is implying that that whole reality came into fruition, came into recognition by the members of the convention as a result of the debates and the analysis of the convention. But in fact, Madison and a few others had made that decision before the convention ever met. And Madison is asking the delegates at the convention, at the very beginning of the convention, to accept the fact that the Articles are not adequate and therefore they should be scrapped and replaced by something that will meet the needs of the Union, and that becomes the invitation to distribute copies of the Virginia Plan. Consequently, one must conclude that the convention's decision to go along with this was not the result of their analysis and their arguments at the convention. Rather, they went along with it because those who really orchestrated the convention and the agenda of the convention had done their homework ahead of time. So I think Madison's whole argument that the decision to go beyond the legitimate bounds of their instructions was made by the convention is invalid. The convention didn't make that decision, Madison did. And he asked them to go along with it and buy it. And then he laid out the Virginia Plan, and that became the agenda for the rest of the Constitutional Convention. Madison had effectively co-opted the convention. He had given us clear evidence that those people that really understand Robert's Rules of Order and understand how parliamentary government really works can turn the procedure to their own advantage. You can use the rules of debate to your own advantage if you know how to do it. And I think we see that laid out for us in government at all levels over and over again. The people that have done their homework and made their plans going in always have the advantage over those who come into a convention cold and are susceptible to being persuaded by the first and most effective argument presented to them. But again, I think that, again, this proves the political aptitude, acumen, if you will, of James Madison. He had done his homework. He did his, he knew what he had to do, and he did it. But again, accurately and textually speaking, what he did raises some serious questions, and I think we have to acknowledge them. And that pretty much constitutes what I have to say. Most of what follows in Federalist number 40 is an addendum, is more things piled on to reinforce that official point. But I think the point is made. What Madison sets out to do next in Federalist number 40 is to take on the argument that even though the Articles of Confederation were scrapped, the fact of the matter is the convention really didn't totally throw it out. That in fact the convention in its business, doing its business, continued to adhere to the ingredients of the articles as much as they could. And then he uses probably 25% of Federalist number 40 to make the case that the Constitution created by the convention, even though it was beyond the realm of what they were given the power to do, the fact of the matter is they continually and constantly paid credence and credibility to the articles. Whenever they could, they adhered to the ingredients of the articles. And what he's doing is he's saying to the critics, what would the critics say about the Constitution given what comes out of the convention? That they violated the fundamental principles of the Confederation? And that what the Confederation says was not within the confines or within the parameters of what the convention did? Is that what they would say? I ask you. And then Madison goes through a series of examples. What are these principles? What are these things in the Articles of Confederation that you critics claim the convention violated? And then he goes through a number of examples. And he said, what are these principles? Do they require that in the establishment of the Constitution, the states should be regarded as distinct and independent sovereigns? They are so regarded by the Constitution proposed. In other words, if one of the concerns of the critics is that the Articles of Confederation's willingness to recognize the sovereignty of the states, Madison's saying if that's one of the points of criticism, hell, the Constitution recognizes the sovereignty of the states as well. Then he goes on to another principle, and he said, do these principles require that the members of the government should derive their appointment from the legislatures and not from the people of the states? One branch of the new government is to be appointed by these legislatures. And under the Confederation, the delegates to Congress may all be appointed immediately by the people, and in 2 states they are actually so appointed. So Madison is saying, if the concern about the articles is that the people no longer choose the legislature, Madison said, look at the House of Representatives. The people choose the House of Representatives. Granted, they don't choose the Senate. But half the legislature, the House of Representatives, is chosen directly by the people. So the Constitution doesn't violate that principle either. And then he goes on to a third one and said, do these principles require that the powers of the government should act on the states and not immediately on individuals? In some instances, as has been shown, the powers of the new government will act on the states in their collective characters. In some instances also, those of the existing government act immediately on individuals. And so what he does is take you through aspects of the Constitution in order to make the point that even though the convention overstepped its bounds in drafting the Constitution, they still adhered in the internal ingredients of the system that the Constitution created. They still adhered to the principles and the ingredients of the Articles of Confederation. And then he concludes this rather lengthy paragraph of example after example of ways that the Constitution is consistent with rather than contradictory to the Articles of Confederation. Madison closes the paragraph with this sentence, and I think this is an important one. He said, we have seen that in the new government, as in the old, the general powers are limited, and that the states, in all unenumerated cases, are left in the enjoyment of their sovereign and independent jurisdiction. So Madison believes he's won one here. He's gone to the critics and saying, in what areas do you believe that the Constitution violates the Articles? Is this one of your areas? Well, look at this. Is that one of your areas? Well, look at this. Is this one, in other words, he goes through and makes his case in the whole thing and said, I think what we've seen, that like the old government, the new one continues to limit the general powers and to recognize the sovereignty and independent nature of the states. And then I've marked off the next paragraph as yet another wow paragraphs. And I've written a note to myself in which I said, this is really a stretch. Madison is taking his argument here to a degree and a level which I wonder whether in fact it's really legitimate. Madison says, the truth is that the great principles of the Constitution proposed by the Convention may be considered less as absolutely new than as the expansion of principles which are found in the Articles of Confederation. Now Madison goes back to the well, so to speak, and he's made this case, and now he's saying basically that what the Convention did, based on the evidence I've just presented, is expand on the principles of the Articles of Confederation, not totally scrap them. And I would argue that when you look at the powers given to the central government under the Constitution, as opposed to the powers denied to the central government under the Articles of Confederation, Madison's argument here is a real stretch. And then Madison acknowledges something else. He said, in one particular, it is admitted that the Convention have departed from the tenor of their commission. In one area, I admit, Madison says, that they did what they weren't empowered to do. And that was that they have reported a plan which is to be confirmed by the people and carried into effect by 9 states only, rather than the required 13. He acknowledges that this is illegal. But then he makes an argument that even though it's illegal, nobody challenges it. So therefore, everybody accepts the fact that it's okay, because everybody realizes that you can't get 13. But he's going to make that argument anyway, and this is the way he makes it. Listen to how effective Madison is here with his use of numbers. Madison said that while this is true, that the articles required 13 and not 9 states, this has been the least urged in the publications which have swarmed against the convention. In other words, of all the arguments made against the Constitution, the fact that 9 states was adopted as the number to ratify the new Constitution, even though it violates their legitimate commission, this is the least talked about. In other words, there's generally a general acceptance of this. Therefore, that's enough, he says. The forbearance can only have proceeded from an irresistible conviction of the absurdity of subjecting the fate of 12 states to the perverseness or corruption of a 13th. Now Madison is using the reality of the numbers. And he said, the fact that people are going along with this makes sense, because the fact of the matter is they realize that it is absurd to allow the will of 12 states to be subjected to the opposition of the 13th. And then he goes on and gives another example, which is even more dramatic than that. He said, from the example of inflexible opposition given by a majority of 1/60th of the people of America to a measure approved and called for by the voice of 12 states, comprising 59/60ths of the people, is yet another example, still fresh in the memory and indignation of every citizen who has felt the wounded honor and prosperity of this country. Madison is saying, can you allow 1/60th of the population to obstruct the will of the other 59/60ths? What Madison is doing here is making the case that it is absolutely absurd to envision a situation where a minority can dictate to a majority. In an aside, I would ask you to think about that argument from James Madison when you think about Mitch McConnell and the behavior of the minority in the United States Senate to demand a supermajority of 60 states on practically every piece of legislation that comes before the United States Senate. What the Republican minority has been able to do through the Obama administration is to exert the will of the majority over the will of the majority by demanding, using the threat of filibuster, to demand a supermajority of 60 states, 60 senators rather, to move any piece of legislation through the United States Senate. Madison, in this particular paper, in number 40, is addressing the absurdity of that reality. What Madison would say is, if he were here today, is to take the Congress of the United States, specifically the Senate of the United States, and let a minority of the senators dictate the will to the majority, because the majority is not large enough to get 60 senators. If you are successful in keeping all of your troops in line, which Mitch McConnell has been able to do, then Madison would say, what you are doing is violating the very principles of the Republic. And that's exactly what's happening in Washington, D.C. And that is what's been happening through much of the Obama administration. It's pretty clear as we approach the fall elections within the month that the predictions are that all of this is going to change because the Republican Party is going to at least keep its majority in the House, if not strengthen it, and probably is going to be able to elect a majority of Republicans in the United States Senate. But the reality is the Republicans are not going to be able to elect 60 members of the United States Senate. Therefore, they are going to be subject to the same demands of a supermajority that they have imposed on the Democratic majority under President Obama's recent terms. So it's clear that the coin is going to turn as a result of the fall elections. But the reality of that is that the Congress of the United States promises to remain inoperative and shut down and ineffective because of its inability to garner a supermajority, whether it happens to be the Democratic majority up until now or the projected Republican majority that is anticipated to come. That basically, I would suggest to you, raises much of the significance of Federalist number 40. I think it's one of the most important Federalist Papers of all of them. And one of the notes I made to myself at the end is to be sure to go back to this idea of originalism versus the idea of a living constitution. The extent to which the text of the document ought to fix the interpretation of the document for all time, or whether in fact the document ought to be interpreted generally enough to remain adaptable and able to meet changing circumstances and changing situations. In this particular Federalist paper, in number 40, James Madison, the author, acknowledges that while the text will not give him what he wants, the exigencies of the Union demand that the convention find a way to go beyond the limits of the text, in this case, the text of the Articles of Confederation, and do whatever it needs to do as a convention to meet the exigencies of the Union. If the Articles of Confederation won't do it, then let's move them aside and go in a totally different direction. But Madison makes the point that even though they do this, they still adhere to many of the ingredients of the Articles. So in effect, they didn't totally scrap the Articles. They adhered to the principles of the Articles. They continued to employ what they could, but they felt empowered to implement what they needed. That, I think, is one of the key conclusions one can reach about Federalist number 40. that it is yet another example of Madison's insistence that the ends justify the means, and that the Constitution of the United States needs to be adopted, interpreted in such a way that it is able to meet the needs of the nation. And as those needs change, so also must the Constitution and its interpretation change. I think this is incredibly significant, and I think it's something that all of us need to be aware of and need to recognize. And once again, we are within 3 minutes of the end of our program together, but we did complete Federalist number 40. So we have finally reached the goal of what I think is a fairly in-depth analysis of the ingredients of Federalist 39 and Federalist number 40. James Madison's effort to address two of the major complaints of anti-federalists about the Constitution. First, that it violated the principles of Republican government, and second, that it violated the terms of its own appointment. In both of those, Madison has addressed each of those arguments in some detail. And I think it's all of us, left up to us, to draw the conclusion or to make the decision as to whether in fact we believe, along with Madison, that the ends justify the means. Because there's no question that if you stick to the idea of originalism, to the fixed nature of the text of the Constitution of the United States, then there's no question that the convention overstepped its bounds in drafting the Constitution at all. But as I mentioned earlier, if we put this question directly to Antonin Scalia himself, it is my belief that he would resist leading the nation into a direction where he would be willing to say that we must shelve the Constitution of the United States because those who drafted it were not empowered to do that. I may be wrong. As I look at some of the ingredients of the so-called Liberty Amendments that are supported by right-wingers in this country, and in the right-wing ideologues who provide the intellectual fodder for these right-wing extremists, and I put Antonin Scalia in that category, I'm not totally sure that Scalia wouldn't do this. Because in reality, the Liberty Amendments and the rights objectives in calling for a constitutional convention suggest the possibility that if all 12 of those Liberty Amendments were enacted, the Constitution of the United States would effectively have been scrapped and replaced by a confederation form of government that would be organized very, very similar to the structure of the Articles of Confederation, on the ridiculous assumption that a constitutional system like the Articles, where the states would be in total control and the federal government would be rendered the servant of the states, would be able to meet the needs of the 21st century world. A world confronted with the challenges of terrorism, violence, environmental disaster, Ebola, and other international threats that it seems to me to require the kind of decision-making that the reforms these people propose would not make possible. We are at the end of our time. It is 3 p.m. in the East. I want to thank you for being with us. Be safe. We'll look forward to having you with us again next Monday here at the Virtual Center. Thank you.